I finished cutting out the raw pieces, and they fit pretty well. Now the stage is to sand the pieces down a little bit more so they fit just where you want them. So in this case, for the aft piece, I want the leading edge to be aft of this mark, right on the edge. Because this hull, the thickness is so uniform, I won't need to do a ton of sanding, but where I will have to do is kind of in the stern here, so you can kind of see where it's contacting there, right about that area. So I'll kind of incrementally sand that down a little bit until I can get the piece to slide back where it's supposed to go. Likewise in the bow, along most of the length here, there's really no concern because of the very uniform thickness. If there was casements, there would be a lot more work probably trying to grind it just right. So what I'll have to do, kind of similarly, I'll have to get the very bow there, and then really just kind of look at the hull. You can see like where it starts to have more of an angle. So about at this spot right here. So you can see as you move forward, it's at an angle. So what I'll do is I'll kind of taper the under edge here a little bit at first. Just do one generic pass because the thickness is pretty uniform, and then see how that fits, and then kind of incrementally go until you get the piece to go in the right location. So I want to make sure that the pieces fit in with each other. What I'll use for most of this is a Dremel with a sanding drum. So I think this is an 80 grit drum. These are really effective, and it does a really great job. In the past I used to use the cutoff disc, but this will tend to burn the wood more, so the sanding drum is preferred. Once the subdeck was cut to size, I traced out the main deck piece using the subdeck as a template. You can see in the bow here, because it's flared out, I added a little buffer because the top will end up being wider and be tapered. Then you can see I drew where the deck piece cuts are going to be. I make the cuts so I can use the same piece of wood for the outer rim and then the deck pieces, because the cuts are only about 1/16 of an inch thick. They can work out, so you don't end up having to use multiple pieces of wood. Instead of doing the circles for the holes, what I'll use is the cutoff wheel on a Dremel and make a slit there to put the blade of the jigsaw through. There's the cut with the Dremel that I'll use to put the blade through to make the cut this way, and then I'll cut from the bottom up to cut this middle piece out, and then once the middle piece is out I can cut it in the middle for the two different deck pieces. Now I'll cover making the aft deck portion, which I'm going to use this 1/16 inch thick fiberglass sheet. You can get them at McMaster. So I'll take my subdeck piece, which has been cut to size, and then I'll flip it over and trace it out. And then I'll use these kind of like these edge pieces that are partial as templates to draw where the deck piece needs to be cut. So you can kind of see the lines here as I go down. There's the back edge, and then the lines here. So it's always good before you put the subdeck in to make sure you trace it, because that'll make the deck pieces much easier. And then for this stuff, to cut it out, I'm going to use a Dremel with a cutoff disc. Because if you use the jigsaw, it will eat the blades very, very quickly. I know that because I tried it once and it did not work out. So I'll just use a Dremel and then, cut on the desired line. And then that'll be my last deck piece. At this point, I have the subdeck and the deck pieces all cut out. I just finished cutting out the aft piece. You can see here. It'll still have to be trimmed a little bit once the deck rim is permanently installed, based off where it kind of ends up when the epoxy dries. But by cutting it out at this point, I have a pretty good idea of the shape, and then any adjustments will be kind of small. And you can see on the main deck portion, using the Dremel to cut through right here made it so this was all just from one piece of wood, which is nice. At this point, I'm going to attach the two pieces of the subdeck together. So I have the forward piece, which goes the bulk of the length of the hull, and then the aft piece. But now that I've already done the tracing out and cut out the deck pieces, I can attach them. Now I'm going to attach them in the hull because the alignment between the two is important. So if I attached them on the bench separately, they might not line up exactly with the hull the way it is. So with the different levels here, you can kind of see the so the forward portion, I have the 1/4 inch subdeck, 1/8 inch deck. Here I have a 1/4 inch piece here, which will kind of be made up. That height will be made up from the fiberglass deck and the magnetic tape. So I'm going to end up with a 1/8 inch overlap right here. And you can kind of see at the bottom. So this bottom piece is 3/16, so I need to add a 1/16 of an inch to this forward piece, and then I'll just make a little bridging piece to connect the tube that goes from here to here on the underside. So I'll probably glue those on to one of the pieces outside of with the subdeck removed, so it's kind of set, ready to go, and then I'll put the second piece in and then glue it down. I'll just use super glue for this because it dries fast, and if I used epoxy I'd have to wait a pretty long time. And then when I go and fiberglass this into the boat, the deck rim will help hold it together, and not too worried about it strength-wise. I'm ready to glue the two subdeck pieces together. See, I have the aft piece clamped down at the right location, the right elevation, and then I added 1/16 inch plywood to the underside of the forward piece. So what I'll do is just kind of cover this surface and this surface on both sides with CA glue, flip the subdeck over, make sure the forward subdeck's aligned correctly, and then clamp it down. Okay, so I put in the subdeck and then glued it down, put some clamps on it. I'll show how I align the deck when I fiberglass it in, and it's kind of the same method that I have it clamped here. So you can see I have these kind of cross pieces. Basic idea is I get a cross piece that will go slightly larger than the beam, and then it will sit on the edge of the hull, and then I'll use a clamp that kind of goes in contact with the underside of the deck, and it sucks it up against the cross piece, so then you end up with the deck being perfectly aligned with the top of the hull. And I'll do this kind of up and down the hull. The cross pieces I'll cover with wax paper so they don't stick to the epoxy. And then for the deck rim, the second layer here, I'll end up with a series of clamps, kind of like this. I'll just show the aftermath of the joint so you can see how I have the pieces there. And now it's one piece, so it'll be much easier to get it into the hull while fiberglassing it in. So the things I'll show are the kind of taper on the bow. So you can kind of see here, I did that with the sanding drum earlier. So you do that to kind of fit the contour up there. I can also show the pump outlet tube, how that's going to work. So you can see I use the sanding drum to sand that away a little bit. But this will kind of go just in like that. So it's relatively level, so the water pump stream doesn't shoot too high. And then I'll kind of fiberglass this in first, really just with some epoxy, and then it will be in place, and then you can kind of see there's some gaps, so it'll take several epoxy jobs to fill this in so it's solid in this area. Another thing I'm going to take care of right now is drilling holes for the deck tie downs. So on Scharnhorst, for the main deck, I'm going to do something similar to like I do in a lot of boats, where you can see I just put a 632 screw up through the subdeck, and then I just use these knurled nuts. You can see the same on Missouri there. You can see like that. There are a lot of different deck hold down methods out there. This one with the screws coming up kind of like studs. This is relatively common. It's what I use in most of my boats. Some other methods are just embedding magnets in the deck, which I have on Congo here. You can see that magnet. There's also one in the deck piece. So Congo's decks are actually only held on by magnets. But sometimes it's good to have the positive seating force. So for Scharnhorst, I'm actually going to drill those holes. You can see I already did this first piece here. Drill the holes for the studs so I can put them through before I install the subdeck, which is something new. Usually I do it later in the build, but screwing them in is always kind of a pain. Not impossible, just kind of a pain, so I figured change it up this time and install them before I put the deck in. So we got the first piece here. You see I have it kind of clamped in place and kind of spaced out because with the epoxy there'll be a little buffer. So I had it there, and then I just measured a 1/4 inch in because this portion right here, the subdeck overlap, is 1/2 inch. So I'll also do that in the midship section here, and then I'll do it in one location in the on the aft deck. I'll do it kind of, I made these little triangle things, so I'll put some studs right there so it's kind of out of the way of the magazine barrels or the gun barrels, and then we'll provide a positive force in addition to the strip magnets that I'll use back there. Okay, so I got all the screws in. I countersunk them a little bit, but you can kind of see how much easier this would be than doing it with the deck already installed on the boat. So looks like they're all pretty level, so I will back them out a little bit, and then one of the first things I epoxy, I'll put some on the threads, then screw them in the rest of the way so the wood around the screws is waterproof. So now I think I'm pretty much ready to go. The next step will be the kind of direct epoxy prep. So things normally do for that would be roughing up the edge, which if you remember was one of the first steps I did on the build, so don't need to do that. I got like one little spot here I got to clean off. Wipe everything down with acetone, and then what I do is I use strips of fiberglass mat, so I'll cut like 1/2 inch wide strips of mat, which is like this material here. And then what I'll do is I'll epoxy them. I'll put some epoxy and attach them right here along the deck rim, and then I'll coat the subdeck with epoxy, and then I will squeeze the subdeck into the hull, and then the fiberglass mat will kind of serve as a filler between the hull and the wood to take up any small gaps between them. Sometimes it comes out cleaner than other times. This hull I don't think will be too bad, but the issue usually comes when you get one side good and then you go to push the other side in, and that will like drag the fiberglass mat down. But I'll give it a shot. So prep work I have to do, I'm going to cover up things like the motor mount and the rudder mount. I'll cover that up with tape because I'm going to get epoxy everywhere on this job. And then I have a series of these pieces here, which will serve as my guides. So I got to cover them with wax paper. And then I will make sure the bench is covered in wax paper, and then make sure all of my clamps are accessible. In this job I will probably use every single clamp I have, just because of the length of the boat. And once all that's done, I will start epoxying. I think I'm just about ready to start the epoxy job. So, see here I cut up the strips, which will be the buffer between the fiberglass, between the hull and the wood. I've covered up the motor mount, so if there's any drips, I won't mess up the seating surfaces. I got these pieces ready, so these become my spacers, and you see they're covered in wax paper. And then I have some wax paper strips I'll use as a buffer between the epoxy and the little clamps. I got all my clamps laid out, so I got the smaller ones, bigger ones by size, and the C clamps kind of already ready to go. On the subdeck I have the deck hold down screws backed out, so I just put a small amount of epoxy in there, screw them in. So the general approach, first thing I'll do is I will coat the edge here, and then I'll put these pieces on and then let them soak through. Then I'll take the subdeck piece and coat the complete underside, and then the edges at a minimum. In the past I would leave the underside to do later, in a later epoxy job, but it's easiest if you can get it done now, because you don't need to worry about missing a spot when trying to coat it from with the hull flipped over through the windows. And then once that's coated, I'll put it in. Then I'll kind of cover the top portion that is going to come in line with the upper deck rim. Then I will coat the underside of the the upper deck rim here and the edges, just so I'm sure I have 100% coverage of the wood for waterproofing purposes. And then I'll put that on, and then I'll put the these smaller pieces in the back, I'll put those on, and then I'll start clamping both to using these pieces to set the right height, and then to hold the various pieces together. One thing you really want to be sure of is that the beam is right on the ship. So I measured it out, because on the subdeck sometimes you'll have a little bit of a gap between the hull and the subdeck, so depending on how you clamp it can change what the beam's going to be. If there's a gap and you suck it in, then the beam can be smaller. In this case, it's not a huge concern. There's not a huge difference, and even if it gets clamped in, the beam will still be within tolerance, so plus or minus 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so now I'll get started. I'm using US Composites Epoxy. It's a 3-to-1 ratio between the resin and the hardener. This is a bigger epoxy batch, which for this job, because there's so many surfaces to cover, it merits using this versus West System, which is a smaller batch. I'm actually going to put in some MEK to help thin it out a little bit. Very first thing I'm going to do is put some on the screws, just so I can get that done before my hands get too nasty. It's always good to have a paper towel available to clean up any drips or clean off tools. So I'll first lay down a coat on the edge itself. I'll put the mat down. Probably use a little too much MEK because it's really runny. That'll help it saturate the mat faster. Okay, that's done. So now I'm going to coat the subdeck. It's going to be pretty messy. Basically just kind of start from one end and work my way down. Because I thin the epoxy, it goes on a lot faster and much smoother, which is kind of nice. It would take longer to brush out if I didn't thin it. And I want to make sure I get all the edges. Both the outside edge and the inside edges. You want to make sure you get every surface covered, because the boats sink, so to waterproof the wood, you can't have any uncoated portions, so it'll cause the wood to rot if water gets in there. So if you just kind of like look up and down like the hull or the piece that you're working on, you can kind of tell. Make sure you got everything. What I'm going to do is put some of these cross pieces through. It's going to help prevent the deck from falling. Okay, now the goal here is to not completely mess up the mat, so I'll kind of put one edge in first. And then I'm going to push the hull out as I squeeze it in. And then it looked like it actually went surprisingly well. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of quickly cover the top edge here, and then kind of do the subdeck or the deck rim portion. Now I don't need to cover the entire surface, just where the smaller pieces will go. Yeah, it's just about done. Some of these little ones are pretty easy, so let's put this back one in. This is fun. Alright. So now I want to get this. Make sure I'm doing the underside. Underside and the outside edge. Inside edge doesn't really matter because you can see it, or you can access it very easily from the top side. Pretty good. This into place. Throw these guys in. Alright. Stick the pump outlet tube through. I can do this first. Alright, beautiful. Okay, at this point, I get some extra epoxy, so I'm going to brush that out.